Hi, April.
Hi, Bronwyn.
It's winter solstice, or today's the eve of winter solstice when we're recording.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, I haven't seen the sun. I feel like that's been such a clear reminder of how time at this time of year can be kind of blurry, and there wasn't
yeah,
always ways of marking precise time without that visibility of the sun, that the winter could be a blur of time.
yeah. And where I am around the 50th parallel, the sun is really low. It doesn't come up above the line of trees to the south. And even if we could see it in the deep fog of Vancouver Island winter, and my body completely forgets its diurnal orientation, and it really opens up time in an interesting way.
Hmm.
So thinking about light where you are too as you're listening, what's the sun doing? What's the light doing? That's what these times are all about. Solstice, the sun, soul, stand still, stis. And the standing still, right, is her farthest reach along the horizon to the south.
Yeah.
And she holds her place for 3 days. That mythic 3 days of resurrection, death and resurrection. And that's where we are. That's the point in the year where we are, major solar holiday. Um, we're going to start by sharing a Rilke poem that is called You Darkness. You darkness that I come from, I love you more than all the fires that fence the world. For the fire makes a circle of light for everyone, and then no one outside learns of you. But the darkness pulls in everything, shapes and fires, animals and myself. How easily it gathers them, powers and people. And it is possible a great presence is moving near me. I have faith in nights. That last line, I have faith in nights, is I think that resonates with so much of the work that you and I do, of reminding people of the importance of the dark half of the cycle, whether it's the lunar cycle, the human cycle of rest, or the dark times of the year, because
Mhm.
that's where we're sitting, is in the darkest time.
Yeah. And the dark pulling everything in. I often would consider or think about the fire being a gathering place of like being drawn, a little like the moth of being drawn towards the light, like finding the light and moving towards that. So it feels like in those words, a kind of a reorientation with the relationship of how does darkness draw us in, and is it inward? And is it what's that towards? Movement towards, um, and what's possible in the night. Yeah, I think what the night makes possible.
I think it's going to fit beautifully with the theme that you'll explore with us later, with the visual creative practice
Mhm.
of um, light and dark, positive and negative space, and reorienting ourselves around each of those.
Yeah, beautiful. Hmm. And with that, shall we bring some light
Yes, I
into our space?
yes, beautiful. Okay, and beeswax
Yes.
candle. This is the you've got some new candles that were made by
Yeah,
a
my
young friend.
friend's daughter. I have two. There's a pair, and I'm actually taking the shell of a beeswax candle that burned all the way down
Oh, beautiful.
and reusing it to put this in
That's
it.
so perfectly symbolic of what we're doing, and as the shell of the year empties out
Mm.
and we hopefully reignite our flames. This is the candle that has been following us since the halfway point of the year. and it's got some nice cedar and a few other goodies. So if everyone has your candles ready, this is very seasonal, the lighting of candles and lighting of fires for the rebirth of the sun. Oh, that's beautiful. I just love that symbolism of reigniting inside the empty shell. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's the foundation that's been, carved out, emptied out and carved out. Um, that, without a candle holder to have that be the holding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Mhm. I'm thinking, I know, and we'll get into and exploring just the seasonal aspects, but just thinking about solstice being a day to only have candlelight, to just be lit by the candles,
Mm,
to really go into and appreciate the darkness at a time when it feels like the day's over before it even begins,
yeah.
and I have,
That suggested practice. I wonder about making space for that. Maybe even if you can't pull it off on solstice, just thinking of this as a whole season as it used to be celebrated, a whole sort of season that doesn't have a particular beginning or ending, but carries us through that dark heart of winter. Maybe sometime during these holidays, we can make space for ourselves to have a candlelit day. I love that. I love that. Are we going to move a little bit with you?
yes. All right. So moving towards the light and towards the dark. Um, you can stay seated or stand up if you'd like. The invitation, and I always like to tune in with the sun and the moon and this perception of within yogic anatomy, the right side of the body being connected to the sun, solar, heating energy, invigorating, that kind of go, the sympathetic nervous system, and the left side of the body, the parasympathetic, the rest, digest, lunar, um, receptive nature. So if you'd like to just, even in whatever way, imagining or feeling or sensing the solar side and lunar side of yourself. And the image I just got too is within the energy centers, um, that weaving, that almost like snake-like sine curve weaving,
Mm,
that alchemy between. Um, Sometimes we might feel split down the middle, but that weaving between the solar and lunar. So if you'd like to, bringing the palms of the hands together in this gesture of union of the solar and lunar together within each of us, and knowing that being a part of that lunar in nature of knowing the moon is weaving as well, weaving in and out of light and dark. So from here, if you'd like to, breathing in and reaching the arms upwards and reaching up, and then exhaling and tilting over to one side. So as if our body is the earth, which it is,
mm,
turning, moving towards the light and the sun, and inhaling back to center. And then exhaling that tilt away towards the dark, towards the night, and inhaling, reaching up. And then one more time, exhaling and imagining on the path of the earth around the sun, this being the summer of tilting towards the warmth and the light and the long days. Exhaling, coming back to center, center being like the equinox midpoint. Or was that inhaling? Breathe however you want to, but in that rhythm, if you'd like to, exhaling away and inhaling back up to center. Stretching up, reuniting the palms, the sun and the moon, and coming back down through the midline.
mm.
That rebalancing, and the body is the earth, and just, yeah, I think that feeling of moving towards and moving away is very central to this work that we're sharing seasonally of what
Yeah.
are we moving towards and what are we moving away from. Yeah.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Shall we take a quick guided tour of what's happening in the world of nature and the stars and the human family
Yeah.
at winter solstice? Oops. So here we are at this dark but glittery time of year as we astrologically we're crossing the threshold between Sagittarius and Capricorn. So the mutable end of autumn that's held by mutable Sagittarius, the season of twinkly lights, and into the deep Saturnian beginning of the astrological winter season in the Northern Hemisphere, with that world point of 0 cardinal Capricorn. This is how we orient with the tropical zodiac. It's earth-based, not sky-based. It's time-based, not space-based.
Yes.
And it's the clock, the solar clock of the zodiac. And we're at that reset point, dictated by the sun reaching her deepest point at 0 Capricorn. So that's where we are zodiacally. This little diagram shows that thing that happens where the sun becomes lower and lower on the horizon. Not only does it extend southward on the horizon at rising, but it also descends lower because our relationship to the ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun, is shifting. And the farther north you live, the deeper the sun lowers towards the horizon. So where I live, she, at her highest reach, is at noon or 1 p.m. in the deep winter. She really isn't that far above the horizon. She doesn't rise above that line of trees behind my house to the south, and it's very dark. I think where you are, April, you notice the deepening towards the horizon, but it's maybe not as dramatic.
Yeah, it's not as steep. I
Yeah.
think in this diagram, I think something that helped me make that connection, like you said, with tropical astrology being earth-based,
Yeah.
these lines of latitude
Yeah.
marked where the sun reaches the Tropic of Capricorn, well, reaches the Tropic of Cancer
Yeah.
above the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn below the equator, that
Yeah.
it's
That's super
actually
helpful.
marked on the globe with the point of the sun at that maximum and minimum reach. That for me was like, okay, this is based in the reality of life on Earth.
Yeah. It's the reality of the changing light and the changing patterns of the sun on the face of the earth. So that's the scientific reality that it's based in. Sometimes there's this kind of specious argument between tropical and sidereal zodiac about which is more scientific or which is more reality based. And it's doesn't work because they're both based in different realities.
Mm.
So the reality of the tropical zodiac is time-based, light-based, sun-based, earth-based. It's the relationship that we have with our sun. And where we are now is following her to her deepest point. And yeah, it would be maybe next time we'll share the marked latitudes because it really helps to bring it home that if you're lucky enough to have migrated and are sitting on the equator right now, it's the same path. She's culminates at the top of the sky, and it's equinox every day on the equator. But the farther north or south you go, the more drastic changes in light you'll see until you get into the Arctic, and it's all dark there right now, all dark in the far north. So here's again this idea of the mythic 3 days of death and resurrection. And perhaps this is where that mythic 3 days comes from, is the ancient observation of the stillness of the sun for 3 days at that farthest reach on the horizon. So for those 3 days, those 3 sacred days, today, as we're recording, tomorrow, the actual equinox, and the day after is the solar standstill. We are dwelling in the silence of the lowest light and longest night. Please remember this is Northern Hemisphere based. So for Southern Hemisphere, this happens at the Cancer solstice. The strength of the sun dies and is reborn. That's what all the myths cluster around, or many of them. Sun rises further south, path of the sun is lowest. And psychologically, emotionally, mythically, and actually in the sky, the light diminishes, then returns. After the standstill, there's a progress towards the light. We have the longest night, and then the night grows shorter. So where are you on the globe right now? What are you noticing about the change of light, the change of the sun, and your body's response to that? This is the question that I invite you to take time to journal on as we progress into this season. What do you notice about light and dark where you are? And you can expand on that by tapping into how it feels in your body and how you respond to that. So, of course, plant life, our beautiful plant companions, are so affected by the changes, the solar changes. And we can also see how we derive so much of our story, symbolism, and celebration from what we observe in the natural world. And what we observe right now, especially if you're a little farther north and you're in a place where we're in deep frost or where there's snow, is there's this beautiful concentrated sweetness at this time of year. Everything has drawn in, the sap in the trees has drawn in, the sweetness is concentrated in the berries, the fruits that remain past the autumn season. And there's also a concentration of color, and this seems like this really beautiful conversation between plant life and animal life, where the plants are saying, hello, hello, I've preserved some sweetness and light for you to come and feast on at this very dark and frozen time of year. So we look for the red, we look for the green as symbols of, not only symbols of, they become symbols, but we look for those as markers of nourishment, sweetness, concentrated richness and light. It's like the light is now being held by the plants. It's no longer in the sky. And that's why we have those beautiful evergreen leaves. This is mistletoe, which grows in oak trees. It's actually a parasite on oak trees, but the effect in the winter is this deciduous oak that no longer has its greenery is covered with this beautiful greenery of the mistletoe with berries, and then all kinds of different red berries that are present at this time of year. And there's our symbolism, our red and green of Christmas. And I love this idea of the shelter, the concentrated sweetness, the preserved light, and the green reminder of life that the plants, in their great generosity as always, hold for us and for all of animal life. And it's that reminder of the fact that life goes on, these evergreen things, and that sweetness is still available even in the darkest times. So what do you notice? This might not be dramatic for you. It might not be the red berries in the snow that's so classic, but there is some energy happening in the plant life around you right now. And notice if it is a signal from the plants about what nourishment is available, what sweetness is available at this time that's not all about the flourishing of above ground life. So you can think about how your little ecosystem in which you are embedded reflects back to you what you're experiencing in this season. And what do you notice about what the plants are giving us right now at this season? And the animals know how to make use of this. Again, this is like classic imagery from our Christmas cards, right? It's the birds feasting on berries in the snow. And that is the season. It's the birds that are still here, the ones who haven't migrated, just really being called to that sweetness and nourishment. And it's sweet to me how the animals get fluffy, right? Fluffy and furry. And they're really focused on foraging for that concentrated sweetness that's left in the plants. Thick pelts and fluffy feathers, right? I was researching what's happening in the animal world in the depth of winter, and I came across this explanation of different strategies for survival. And I thought this would be fun to explore in terms of our own animal body responses to winter, because I hear so much self-criticism about this being a time when we're not productive, or we're really tired, or we don't have a lot to give, we're depleted. And it's because we expect the same from ourselves in the depth of winter as we do at the height of summer, because we live in an industrialized blah, 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 you know the drill. So what other animals are doing are these different survival strategies. Hibernation, we know what that is. You just go to sleep for the winter. Brumation, which is like an even more intense hibernation. It's like turtles do this, right? You dig yourself into the mud and just stay there. Diapause. Okay, this is what insects do. And they basically suspend all life activity in their bodies. Some of them even freeze solid, and through some miracle are reborn in the spring. Torpor, this is my own animal body in the winter. It's like a semi-hibernation where you're mostly sleeping, but you go out if there's some like nice sweet berries or the sun is shining. And migration, of course, just get the heck out and go to the tropics. Or you just adapt. You just forage, you survive. So which one are you in the winter? Which one are you? What does your body really want to do? Do you want to get the heck out and go spend the winter in Mexico? Do you want to just lie in bed and get up only for the essential work? Would you really rather just check out? What's happening? And I think just knowing what the animals are doing kind of gives us permission to allow ourselves to be as we are at this season. The change of light really affects us. The cold weather affects us. Our animal body responds in natural ways to this. So hopefully this is an invitation for you to be more gentle with yourself. You can reflect on that in your journaling, or you could tune into the natural world and notice what the animals around you are doing, including their absence and presence, which comes back again to that idea of absence and presence. This is just a light touch. There are people other than me who have done beautiful deep dives into the traditions around Yule, especially the Northern European traditions. I highly recommend the work of Carmen Spagnola and of Danica Boyce, and deep dives into the folklore of Winter Solstice. And they both have podcasts available right now that you can accompany you through the season, and you'll learn so much about the folklore. So just the lightest touch, this is a time when cultural holidays tend to focus around themes of rebirth, survival, and liberation. Christmas, winter solstice, Yule, that going back to the Roman Empire, Saturnalia, and Hanukkah. This is, again, just scratching the surface. There are so many more winter solstice celebrations. What are your ancestral traditions? What have you left behind, and what do you bring forward? How does your family connect back to its lineage? Or what other lineages have you drawn from in your celebrations of the season? And how can you connect back your very contemporary holiday celebrations with things that have come before? And how do you tune into and respond to these ideas of death and rebirth, of survival, or of liberation at this time of year? Are some things to consider. Um, the place where April and I were playing with a little bit more deepening into the traditions was with this going back to the Anglo-Saxons, from whom we of Northern European origin derive so many of our traditions because of the yeah, just because that's it. That's our history.
Mm.
And this comes from Bede. You've probably seen versions of this, especially in the neo-pagan world of the Anglo-Saxon months. Did you want to speak to this, April?
I think for me, there's like the curiosity of naming,
Mm,
how that goes along with our relationship with time, our relationship with the year, and with the seasons. And so, and you and I were talking about, you know, Bede, who was a monk in Northumbria and wrote in Latin and is not always the most reliable source of information, that there were some things that he made up. I think in this like reinvention of a relationship that may draw on the past and ancestral traditions and also looking forward of how we might relate to and name time in a different way. And so it doesn't necessarily have to go back to like, well, this is what Bede said the months were,
yeah.
because it's so, it's culturally specific and time specific in a way. Like for
Mhm.
May, unless you have a ranch and are milking cows, referring to or referencing that time of year as, and my pronunciation of Old English is not, it's nothing that I've ever, spoken, but like that three milking time of the,
Yeah.
that it speaks to abundance, right? So what are the other ways of that time of year that might feel like abundance where, um, that's showing up in the environment. And then December and January. And this is what I was speaking to a little bit at the beginning of this kind of blur of like the month of Yule and the second Yule. And it's kind of maybe
Yeah.
depending again where you are in the world, things might blur together as this is a darker time with less light.
Yeah.
The one thing that I was interested as we weave the conversation with, the sun that marks the solstices, the naming for what we call October now. And I think maybe part of this curiosity for me comes from how unimaginative and unpoetic most of the names of the months are. That most like, let's see, September, October, November, December. Okay. Almost half of them are referencing just numbers in an order, in a sequence that no longer go in that order and sequence.
Yeah.
So we've already have like almost half of the year. Just wait. We're why now are we still talking about time as this like collage together mismatch of things that could be so much more poetic? And so I think being drawn to those names and looking to the one for October as the winter full moon month
Mhm.
of starting that a winter time
Yeah.
referencing whenever that full moon is, then okay, now it's
We're
official.
now we're wintering.
Now we're wintering.
I
Um,
did I did read a little bit about this back at Samhain,
mm,
and this this naming winter full moon month derives from the fact that the Anglo-Saxons only acknowledged two seasons, winter and summer, and the very important dates that kind of align with the cross quarters of Samhain and Beltane were first frost and last frost.
mm,
So where I am, this lines up almost exactly, that the October full moon will be within days of the first frost.
mm,
So I imagine that parts of northern England are like that as well, that is the actual alignment. So this is the first it's just as you said, the moment that wintering begins and everything that that brings with it. And I kind of love the simplicity of the two seasons and
Mm-hmm.
the way that I don't know, it reflects so many different cycles and the idea that we're either summering or wintering and tending towards one or the other. And
Mm-hmm.
that beautiful division that falls on the cross quarters. I don't know, there's something very resonant about that for me. And I think what I hear you saying is that this is not so much, I mean, it's interesting historically, right? But it's interesting as an invitation into using all the things that we've talked about in this uh, little presentation so far, like looking at what's happening with the plants, looking at what's happening with the animals, feeling into what's happening for you, thinking about how your family and your lineage have approached this time of year or any time of year,
Mm-hmm.
and taking the opportunity to rename in with this as a kind of a model, like what's happening, like it's the month of cakes. Well, it may not be the month of cakes for you. Maybe you do have a month of cakes. I have a friend who has like cake day. It's just a thing that she's developed with her friends and family. So they maybe have the month of cakes. Everybody brings a cake. There's like, 24 cakes out on the table. It's cake day. It's just a personal holiday. So we all have things like that. And the invitation is to be creative and place specific, because that's the whole thing. It's like what's happening around you. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
you do have a ranch and you know you are milking your cows 3 times a day. It seems to be a return to this lifestyle, from what I can tell on Instagram. Lots of people are milking cows. I'm sorry, but most of us are not. So that's what you're saying, right? It's an invitation to renaming in a way that's personal and makes sense for you.
Yeah. Something just occurred to me too with the solar and lunar, that connection of how the 2 months around the winter solstice were given the same name and the 2 months around the summer solstice. I mean, in the
Mhm.
summer time of June and July, um, being referenced with the same name, of how those kinds of two poles and those polarities
Yeah.
really kind of extend, of like being in what can feel like sometimes in the winter, like never ending. And then in the summer, like, oh, the light is always going to be here, on and on and on.
Yeah.
So that parallel then,
Oh, I love
it-
that. Those seasons are so expansive.
yeah, that it's really like when you're in it, you're in it. So why call it something else? Because it's going to
Yeah.
go ongoing Yule. Um, it occurred to me in this moment as you were speaking, how that parallels the lunar cycle with
Yeah.
the full moon and the new moon. That yes, there's a moment of fullness and there's a moment of emptiness in the new moon. However, that window of time feels maybe longer,
Yeah.
or even with that mythic 3 days of the moon disappearing for 3 days
Yeah.
at the new moon,
Right.
right? That here's this other parallel way of in speaking about time and relating that. Again, solar and lunar time are very, very different modes and modalities to relate to on their own terms. But I feel like this is a meeting point or a crossover point
Yeah.
with the solstices, especially in their relationship with new and full moons.
And I see this in the way people talk about the moon too, especially people who are not initiated into the mysteries of the moon. And I sometimes I have to suppress myself. If somebody like 3 days before the full moon is saying, I just saw the beautiful full moon in the sky, and I have to just zip it to be like, well, technically it's people appreciate the full moon time, like for 5 or 6 days around the full moon. And the same with the dark moon, which is how many people refer to the new moon. Um, so it's that season. And I
Mhm.
think that's a beautiful parallel between that season of midsummer and the season of midwinter.
Yeah, of how it extends.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other piece of that in approaching the winter solstice and what then with Christmas sort of getting mapped onto the timing of what may have also been a sacred night of the Mother's
Yeah.
Night.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of people reclaiming that as well as a practice. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Can I, just before we leave this behind, say
Sure.
one more word about bead? Because I think we both feel strongly about this when this kind of list is shared, that it's important to know that this was one guy and he got a lot wrong. The problem being that he's kind of a bottleneck for this knowledge, that there's, as far as written knowledge, there just isn't a lot available from this period of history. So everyone goes back to Bede as sort of the authority, but he wasn't so much the authority as just a guy who was living in isolation and was fascinated with the calendar and cultural festivals. And the places where he didn't have knowledge, he filled in
He
with
made it up.
fanciful imaginings. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it's important to know that. Like this thing with the O star, and I still see this out there, that there's this belief that there was this goddess Eostar in ancient Celtic times, and that doesn't actually exist. It's something that Bede made up. There's other things that I'm sure he got exactly right because he had personal experience. And also, it's very regional. It's
Yeah.
very regional.
It's
So
like
these are
hyper
important.
or
Yeah.
specific.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So these are important things to know, not to completely write off this absolutely essential historical document, but to know that it's just to take it with a grain of salt. It's like any other history. It's from a certain time, a certain perspective, and you got to know there's made up stuff in there. So,
Hmm.
so yeah. Okay. This next piece, I think it's so interesting. Like this is the cozy season of festivals, feasting, and light. But there is today, and has always been, this thread of horror almost with Christmas. And we all know the ghost stories of Christmas, from the Tim Burton movies to the Dickens Christmas Carol. Ghost stories are part of Christmas. And there's also what we have a remnant of with, oh, the naughty or nice, like you better be nice or Santa won't bring you anything, goes back to actually much darker, sort of scary figures like Krampus, who we're hearing more about these days as people bring more and more folklore. But this sort of Pan-like figure who actually came and stole children. And what a horrible story. But I imagine, this is just purely my imagining about where does this come from? If we think about this time of year and the demands of this time of year, if you give birth, if you have a newborn at this time of year in a subsistence culture in ancient times, it's that fear is very real, the fear of losing your child. So of course stories develop about that. Superstitions and protective practices, it's natural for us to try to find remediation and assuagement for the forces of nature and the forces of fate that bring us close to death, loss, starvation. Were all very, very real possibilities in any given winter in a culture that looks very different than the comfort that the relative comfort that, not that we don't have problems, but they're not of this nature. So that's my imagining of where a lot of this darker stuff comes from. It truly is a time of year when we confront our fears. We're going into Saturn's seasons. Saturn rules our fears. Saturn is the darkness beyond. And one of the things that Saturn asks us to do is to mature ourselves by confronting our fears. And the paradox and beauty of that is something that we see in this story of the Christmas Carol, which is that by truly confronting the wisdom of our fears, we cultivate joy.
Mm.
And we cultivate presence in the moment, and we cultivate generosity. So I think it's natural to come up with these stories, both to kind of scare ourselves because it's fun to scare ourselves, but also to somehow feed and assuage the hungry ghosts around us. And I think there's a deeper psychological purpose to working through that, which is, as I said, like to find the joy in the present moment. I love watching every movie version of The Christmas Carol. It's truly one of my favorite teaching stories of all time. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And I'm actually going to do some writing over this holiday on Substack about the association that I make between the ghosts, the spirits of Christmas past, present, and future, and Jupiter, Saturn, and Mercury, and how those archetypes function in our lives. So it's one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite stories because I think it's very, very rich and deep, more so than it would appear on the surface. So this is a legitimate, those of you that like to listen to ghost stories on Christmas or have, I know some families have that tradition of like watching really scary Christmas movies. It's never been our thing, but it's a legitimate part of the tradition going way back. So I didn't want to leave that out because that's the whole thing, right? We don't want to leave that out.
Yeah.
It's
And I
part of the
wondered,
remediation.
it occurred to me too with the connection of Saturn and Kronos. And I was just at a performance a couple nights ago. Um, one of the lines in the musical was time eats all his children in the end.
Oof, yeah,
And it just struck me so hard. And then seeing this image of, yes, these are, children and babies and the being carried away by the goat. And um, with Kronos eating his children and wintertime being a time, often if somebody is on their way out, is like
yeah,
wintertime also facilitates that. Um, but yeah, coming to face with the mortality of things, and especially when most life appears to be dead anyway,
yeah.
except for that evergreen. Yeah.
It's the reality. And Saturn's all about unvarnished reality. And that's it. That's a tipping point between Sag, which is so visionary and so fully optimistic, ruled by Jupiter, this the season of parties, literally. And then this weird tipping point where we move from one thing into its opposite. And I find that fascinating every year that all the buildup to Christmas is so Sagittarian. And then the day comes and there's sort of this Saturnian silence that settles over everything. And then at New Year's, after you clear everything away, there's this sparseness and cleanliness. And it's so representative of those very different vibes of Sag and Capricorn. And we're sitting right as we record, right on that threshold. So
Right.
into
What
the silence.
I'm curious about, because I am so focused, I feel like my work does revolve around how to transition through change and how
Yeah.
the lunar cycle helps us to support in that so that it can be applied to the solar year, because some of these transitions in the solar year can be experienced as so abrupt. And I feel like you just named it, going from Sagittarius to Capricorn, like there is an abruptness that mm, because of seasonally, because of everything that we've talked about, like how to navigate that. And this is part of why we're sharing this, is like
Yeah.
really navigating with awareness and, you know, taking everything in so that it can be digested and put into practice in a
Yeah.
way that supports us with the transitions through the
Yeah.
time in the seasons.
Yeah. So I think that this leaves us open for a recreation of how you want to mark and celebrate and share. What do you find most compelling as you weave all of these very different threads together? What are the most important ones for you? this holiday, I think part of the reason that I usually I have like this slide
Mm.
is usually overflowing. Like I have so many ideas. And I think part of the reason this list is so small and I was struggling with it is because so much is prescribed. There's not a lot of room around this holiday for us to reinvent, um, for a lot of reasons. And yeah, the invitation is there. And I really don't want to add more to the prescriptions and rules and oppressive traditions that you might already
Well, I think the
be working with.
expectation,
The
yeah,
expectation, yeah, thank
the
you. That's a better
expectations
word.
can be so high, even if, I think of, you know, f- for anyone who's outside of maybe family traditions or traditional family practices of a kind of Christmas that is going on and on, um,
And on.
and on that, a kind of a reinvention. But what struck me in this moment is holidays are holy days. And so really, how is it to create this day as a holy day when, capitalism has completely taken over and commerce and all of these things that have taken over a holy time of re-imbuing that with the holiness um, that it deserves because of, it being such a significant moment in the wheel of the year, in
Yeah,
the turning towards the light, but
yeah,
just as we saw with like 2 months named Yule, it's like it's turning, but the turn is slow. It's a
yeah,
slow turn. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Personally, I did things a little bit differently this year in that usually I take most of December off from client work and jump right in after the new year. And this year I decided to do it the other way and I worked right up until like my last client of the season was yesterday. And I'm not going back until mid-January. I'm taking that whole traditional Yuletide, which extends from winter solstice to, I forget what exactly the marker is, but it usually falls around January 12th. Um, I'm taking that whole season and I'm going to explore how that lands differently for me and if that lands differently and if that sets me up to go into the new year more rested. So far, no. So far, I'm like, well, maybe I need December and January. Um, but traditionally, this marks the beginning, or sometime around this time marks the beginning, not Advent, but older traditions than if we're talking about that whole season. They usually begin around now the winter solstice and extend into January. So I'm going to play with that personally and see how that fits. That's my personal reinvention for this year. Are you doing anything differently this year, April?
I am going on a hermitage. Um,
It's wonderful.
it's for 4 days. And year it happens to be leading up, this is 2024, leading up to a new moon and leading up to my birthday. And I find that every year, do you want to stop share so I can,
Oh,
I
sorry.
can
Yes.
figure that. Um, to leading up to the new year. And I find that if I don't take that time off, I block it off on the calendar, but I hadn't actually scheduled myself to be away. Um, and my husband, in his wonderful nature of like, what's the plan? It's on the calendar, it's blocked off. What are you going to do? I often around December feel like, oh my gosh, it's already, that programming around it's the end of the year and do I have everything in order and what's going on and
Oh,
turning and spinning the wheels. Um, my husband's like, well, what's your plan? And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go on hermitage. And I found a tea house that is called like the Hermitage, up in Northern California. So yeah, just having the plan of actually have to step away. If I'm
yeah.
still at home, I have young, my kids aren't
Yeah. Your kids are
young,
at
but
home.
I'm still tending to all the things that I tend to year round.
Yeah.
If I don't actually get a break from that, I cannot enter the next
Yeah.
season feeling like I've had, those 3 days away or whatever, whatever the time is. So that's what I'm doing, and it leads up to my birthday, and I haven't made plans for that. I find myself more and more wanting to be a hermit and less like the parties of New Year's Eve, which is my birthday. Um, that is like it feels so foreign, and my body
Yeah.
is like, why did I ever want that? But
Yeah.
that youth. So yeah, I think, I have family that comes to town, and I don't travel um around this time of year because I'm close to my family of origin in the neighborhood. And so we have multiple different kind of gatherings of so and so's house for this, and then our house for the morning, and then another house for the evening. So we just kind of move around and like feed each other. And
Uh,
yeah, but yeah, all the gift giving that can also lean like to have practices around that kind of gathering of gifts earlier on before the full winter time hits. That's what I want to put in place for next year is really do all of that gathering the month before. So it's the ability to just be and enjoy,
mhm.
um, and be present and be like not running around. Yeah, I feel like I get better every year. That awareness gets applied. And so maybe that can be our inquiry, and that prompt um, for all of you is to, if there's any knowing already of what you
Mhm.
want to put in place and to apply to next year, like what kind of like derailed things,
Yeah.
to make note for yourself. And that's how we, shift that relationship and dynamic of time being something that's like as a imposed of from the outside, or there's scarcity, but to experience ourselves within time and within the cycles. And that's what so much of the almanacs around
Yeah.
the telling of time and the instructions, especially with agricultural society, but the instructions that were given of how to transition and what to do. Because if you don't plow the fields, then when the time comes, it's not ready. And so, like, if I don't get gifts, if that's something, a tradition that I want to continue, and it goes up to the wire and then it causes stress, then like that's not the kind of way to relate to
Yeah.
this, right?
And the piece that's so, all of that is really valuable. And the piece that I find valuable for right now is that idea of an almanac being a living document, and what you just said about like making notes for yourself next year. I actually did that for myself last year. I just, in my new planner, back a year ago, in my new 2024 planner at that time, I went to the December notes and I wrote a bunch of notes for myself, like, be sure to do this, don't do that. You don't need to buy wrapping paper because you already have a bunch in the garage. Um, and also book off until January 12th. Like I made notes to myself based on how I was feeling in that moment. And this is the beauty of tracking, right? Because we forget in between. As much as we think we're going to remember, we forget in between. It was so valuable. I had even forgotten I made those notes. So I opened the December page and I was like, oh, thank you, past self. And I took her advice and it was so helpful. So tracking, keeping a personal almanac, these are such valuable gifts to our future self.
Yeah, I love that. And that's where this blocking off the days for the Hermitage came from, is
Yeah.
for maybe even 2 years, I saw myself get so cranky, and the so-called new year would come, and I would be cranky and having taken care of everyone else except for myself. And
Yeah.
so that's where the blocking off of the time came from, that um, experience of things not working.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, personal almanacs. I mean, um, my design mind is like, oh, how could I, it could be straight into the calendar, but also just
Yeah.
a page per seasons of notes to self seasonally of things to remember.
Ooh.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is what this work I feel like is based around, these inquiries and questions of how
Yeah.
we relate to the season so we can be present with them,
Yeah.
be a part of the shifts and changes, and have things that are in place that, yeah, the holidays, that they're holy in whatever way we want to make them special, to mark the time and the changes. Um, and then how we do that with food or with activity or with practices or with places we may um, go, or things that we may, want to create anew. So yeah, personal almanac. Yeah, well, should we take a pause here and we'll come back for the creative practice?
Yes.